She married a man who could not see her face, and he still knew exactly who she was. The bells were ringing for her sister. Lily was the one who was supposed to walk that aisle, the one promised to the blind Alpha King that no pack dared cross. But Lily was shaking too hard to stand, so Arya did what she had always done. She disappeared into someone else's fate. No one had told the groom which sister was coming. No one needed to. He was blind. What difference could it make? But when Arya said her vows, his head turned, sharp, certain, as if her voice alone had told him everything her veil was hiding. He should not have known. No one had ever known. Not once. Not in his whole cursed life. And yet, from the very first words she spoke to him, Daemon Blackwood never once mistook her voice. What he chose to do with that knowledge, that was the part no one saw coming. Chapter 1. There is a kind of silence that only exists in places built for celebration and emptied of everyone who should have come. The church in Marrow Hollow held that silence the morning Arya Bennett learned what her family had become. No guests, no music, no rows of restless children counting minutes until the feast. Only her parents, herself and her sister, and the candlelight that could not quite reach the front of the altar where two men stood waiting, one broad-shouldered and still as carved stone, the other watchful at his side. Grief has a particular weight. It does not announce itself. It simply sits on the chest and stays there. In the small room behind the altar, Lily Bennett was not crying the way brides are supposed to cry. This was the other kind. The kind that comes from somewhere lower than the heart, somewhere people don't usually let strangers see. "I can't," Lily whispered, her hands fisted in the white fabric of her gown. "Arya, I can't do this. They say no one comes back from his kingdom. They say—" "I know what they say." Arya took her sister's face in both hands, the way their mother used to when they were small and frightened of thunder. "Breathe. Just breathe." It hadn't always been like this. Arya still remembered her father's old shop on Founder's Row, the smell of new cloth, the bell above the door that rang every time someone came in to buy a life they could afford. She remembered when the Bennett name meant something other than debt. Then the ship that was supposed to carry their fortune home never arrived, and the man who had convinced her father to risk everything vanished within the week, taking the family's last hope with him. What followed was not a single collapse but a slow unraveling. The shop sold, the furniture sold, and finally, on a night Arya had never spoken of since, men coming to collect what money no longer could. That was the night her father's leg was broken, and never properly healed. Poverty does not arrive all at once, Arya had learned. It arrives one small theft at a time, until there is nothing left to take but your name. And her name had already been taken once. 3 years ago, she had stood at a different altar in a dress she had chosen herself, waiting for a man who never came. By the time the whispers caught up with her, that he hadn't shown because he'd already had her, that no honest man would want what he'd left behind. The truth no longer mattered. A lie spoken loudly enough becomes its own kind of fact. Arya had been 28 then. She was 31 now, unmarried, and in the arithmetic of Marrow Hollow that made her worth less than nothing. So when the offer came from Ravenmoor, a single sealed letter requesting Lily's hand for the Alpha King, attached to enough gold to erase every debt their father carried, there had been no real choice in it at all. There rarely is, when the ones doing the choosing have already lost everything but the people they love. "Listen to me," Arya said now, already working at the ties along the back of Lily's gown. "Give me the dress." Lily's eyes went wide. "What? No. No one out there has seen your face. They don't know you. They only know the name on the letter." Arya's hands didn't stop moving. "I'll wear the veil. I'll walk down. You go out the back with mother and father, and you keep going. And when he finds out? Then that becomes my problem, not yours." Arya pulled the gown free and stepped into it herself, the fabric heavier than anything she had ever worn, heavy as a sentence read aloud in court. "Promise me, Lily, if this goes wrong, if he comes looking, you don't stop running." Lily was crying again, but it was a different kind now, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have just been handed their own life back. "I promise," she whispered. Arya lowered the veil. The world went soft and ivory-colored, distant, as though she were already watching her own wedding happen to someone else. There is a particular grief in always being the one who stays behind to take the weight so someone you love can run free of it. No one writes songs about that kind of love. It rarely asks to be thanked. It only asks to be allowed to do its work. The aisle was longer than she remembered aisles being. She walked it alone, without music, without her father's arm, with nothing but the sound of her own shoes against stone, and the question that had followed her for 3 years, now finally catching up to her again. Why was it always her left holding what no one else wanted to carry? At the altar, the broad-shouldered man did not turn his head as she approached. She had been told he was blind. The rumor had reached even Marrow Hollow, wrapped in cruelty, as most rumors about Ravenmoor were. Cursed since boyhood, the stories said, cannot see his own hand before his face. A king ruling a kingdom he will never see. It should have made the deception easier. A blind man could not catch her in a lie written across a stranger's features. She reached him. She lifted her chin beneath the veil, more out of habit than hope, since there was no one there to meet her eyes. And then she said her vows, her voice low, careful, pitched exactly the way Lily's voice pitched when she was nervous. Damon Blackwood's head turned toward her, sharply. Certainly, the way a man turns when he has heard his own name spoken from across a crowded room. The priest faltered, glancing between them. The watchful man at Damon's side went very still. Arya's heart slammed once, hard, against her ribs, certain the deception was already finished before it had properly begun. Chapter 2. She waited for him to tear the veil away. She waited for the silence to break into accusation, for the priest to be told to stop, for her father's name to be cursed from the altar in front of God and whatever else was listening. None of it came. Damon Blackwood simply stood there a moment longer, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear, and then, slowly, he faced forward again. When the priest asked him to lift her veil and seal the vows, he did not move to do it. He only extended his hand, palm open, waiting. Arya placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, careful, far gentler than she had braced for. It was over before she understood it had truly happened. No kiss, no unveiling, only a quiet man turning toward the doors of his own church, his beta falling into step beside him, and Arya following, because there was nowhere else now that she belonged. The carriage that carried her away from Marrow Hollow was finer than anything she had ridden in since she was a girl, and colder than anything she had ever known. Damon sat across from her, his broad frame filling the bench, his face turned toward the window, as though he could see the hills passing, rather than merely feel the carriage sway beneath him. He had not said a single word since the church. Any moment now, she told herself, watching his jaw, the stillness of his hands resting on his knee. Any moment now he will understand what was done to him, and then I will learn exactly what kind of man hides behind all those stories. But the moment did not come, mile after mile, and the silence between them began to feel less like a held breath and more like a place he had simply always lived. She studied him because there was nothing else to do, and because some old, foolish part of her had never quite stopped studying men like this, searching their faces for some sign of the gentleness the world insisted men like him did not have. His jaw was strong beneath a short, dark beard. His hair was tied back from a face that had likely once been called beautiful, before someone decided to call it monstrous instead, and his eyes, pale and unfocused, moved every so often toward sounds she herself had barely noticed. A bird outside, the creak of the wheel, her own quiet breathing. He listens to everything, she thought. Perhaps that is what a man does when the world has taken away his eyes and left him only his ears to survive by. The realization unsettled her more than his silence had. When the carriage finally crested the last hill, the trees parted, and Ravenmoor rose ahead of them, dark stone walls climbing toward a colorless sky, towers like blades against the clouds, gates wide enough to swallow a small village whole. Arya had heard 100 stories about this place, and not one of them had prepared her for how quiet it was. No screaming, no chains, only wind moving through high windows and guards who watched the carriage pass with something closer to weariness than menace. A kingdom can wear its reputation like a mask, she thought, and the longer she looked at Ravenmoor's walls, the more she suspected the mask did not fit the face beneath it. The gates groaned open. The sound settled into her chest like a verdict. No one who enters this kingdom ever leaves it the same person they were before the gates closed behind them. Whether that is a curse or a mercy, depends entirely on what you were trying to leave behind. They escorted her to the king's private chambers once night had fully claimed the castle, and Arya walked the stone corridors still wearing her wedding dress, her heart beating out a rhythm of pure dread. At any moment he would understand. At any moment the gentle, listening man from the carriage would become the monster the stories promised, and she would learn precisely what happened to women who lied to alphas. The chamber door opened onto firelight and warmth. Daemon stood near the hearth, already changed into a dark, loose-fitting robe, his back partly to her, broad shoulders outlined in orange light. Arya stopped in the doorway and made a decision. She would not cower through this marriage the way she had cowered through every disaster before it. She reached up and tore the veil from her face. "You should know," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that I am not who you asked for." Daemon turned toward her fully now, his pale eyes settling somewhere near her face, with unsettling precision, for a man who could not see it. "I know," he said quietly. The words landed like a struck bell. "You." She stopped, started again. "You know? I knew at the altar." His voice was low, rough at the edges, as though speech were a muscle he rarely allowed to work. "The moment you spoke." Arya stood frozen in the doorway, the veil crumpled in her fist, trying to understand how a blind man had recognized a stranger's voice over the only voice he had ever been promised, and trying to understand, with a slower, colder dread, exactly how long he had known, and exactly how much of the day that followed had been a kindness she had mistaken for ignorance. "Then why," she whispered, "did you say nothing?" Daemon's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and Arya began to learn the particular cruelty of a silence, chosen on purpose by a man who clearly had his reasons, and clearly did not intend to share them yet. Some stories end at the altar. This one was only just beginning to show its teeth, and if you've ever wondered what it costs a person to be truly known before they're ever truly seen, stay close. This kingdom has more secrets than a single chapter can hold, and not all of them are finished revealing themselves yet. If a tale like this one is worth returning for, consider letting this channel know. There are more kingdoms waiting, and more silences worth breaking. Chapter 3. Silence. Arya was beginning to understand, came in more than one shape. There was the silence of a man who had nothing to say, and there was the silence of a man choosing, carefully, deliberately, what not to say yet. Daemon Blackwood's silence was the second kind, and it was already proving far harder to live inside than the first. "You don't owe me an explanation," she said finally, when it became clear he wasn't going to offer one. "I lied to you in front of a priest. I think the silence should be mine to keep, not yours. You didn't lie to protect yourself. It wasn't a question. You did it for her, your sister." Arya's chest tightened. "How could you possibly know that?" "I didn't, until you said it just now." The faintest movement passed across his mouth, not quite a smile, gone before she could be certain she'd seen it at all. "But I suspected." She wanted to be angry at the cleverness of that, and found, to her own irritation, that she couldn't quite manage it. He did not press her further that night. He showed her, without ever touching her, simply by the calm certainty of a man who had memorized every stone of his own home, to a chamber down the corridor from his, and left her there with nothing but the fire and her own unanswered questions for company. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it came shallow and brief, and she woke before dawn to the sound of the castle already breathing around her. Footsteps in the corridor, low voices, a door somewhere closing with the particular care of people trying not to wake someone who has finally found rest. By the time the sun was fully up, Arya had decided she would not spend her first full day at Ravenmoor hiding in a borrowed room, waiting for the axe she had been promised her whole life to finally fall. The castle she found, walking its corridors alone, did not match a single story she had grown up fearing. Servants spoke to one another in unhurried voices. A child, one of several she would learn, who called the castle home for reasons no one explained to her yet, ran laughing down a hallway and nearly collided with her skirts, then apologized so earnestly that Arya found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. The guards, enormous men who could have crushed her with one hand, stepped aside for her with quiet nods, as though her presence were something to be respected rather than feared. It is a strange thing, to arrive somewhere braced for cruelty, and find only the ordinary, unremarkable kindness of people simply living their lives. Some part of Arya distrusted it more than she would have distrusted screaming. It's a performance, she told herself, more than once, walking the frost-rimmed garden paths alone. No one is this at peace inside a monster's house, and yet the unease she carried did not come from the servants, or the guards, or even the king himself. It came, she realized by midday, from somewhere else entirely, from the woman who found her in the East Gallery shortly after noon, smiling with a warmth so practiced it had clearly been worn many times before. "You must be the new Luna." The woman's voice was smooth, cultured, the kind of voice trained from childhood to fill rooms without ever raising itself. "I confess, we expected someone else, a younger sister, I believe the arrangement said." "Plans changed," Arya said carefully. "How fortunate that they were allowed to." The woman's smile did not move, though something behind her eyes did. "I am Cassandra, Daemon's cousin. I have kept this household running for a long while now, since before he was strong enough to do it himself, you understand. I only want what is best for him. I always have." There was nothing wrong with a single word she said, and yet Arya felt, standing in that gallery with the cold winter light falling between them, the particular chill of meeting someone whose kindness had a current running beneath it that she could not yet name. "He's lucky then," Arya said, "to have someone so devoted. He is fragile in ways the kingdom doesn't see." Cassandra's gaze flicked over Arya with something that might have been assessment, or might have been warning. "I do hope you understand what you've married into, Lady Bennet. It would be unfortunate if you didn't." She left before Arya could ask what, precisely, she was meant to understand. That evening, alone again, Arya found herself standing at a tall window overlooking the rear courtyard, unable to settle, unable to stop turning Cassandra's words over in her mind like a stone she couldn't quite identify by touch alone. Below, in the dim blue light past sunset, a figure crossed the courtyard toward the back gates, tall, cloaked, unmistakable even at that distance. Daemon, leaving his own castle, alone, in the dark, the same way a man leaves somewhere he does not want to be seen leaving. "Where do you go?" she wondered, watching until the dark swallowed him whole, that even your own home cannot know about it. She did not yet have a single fact to build an answer from, but she had a feeling, sharp and unfamiliar, that whatever waited for her at Ravenmoor was not the danger she had been promised, and that the real danger, whatever it was, had a much gentler smile than she had been warned to expect. Chapter 4. There is a particular madness that grows in a person who has decided to watch someone in secret. It begins as curiosity and ends, almost always, as something closer to hunger. Arya told herself, the second night, that she was simply concerned for the welfare of a household she had married into without her own consent. By the fourth night, standing behind the same heavy curtain at the same tall window, she no longer bothered pretending the excuse was true. Every night, near the same hour, Daemon left. She had learned, in those first days, to read small things about him the way she imagined he had spent a lifetime learning to read small things about everyone else. He moved through Ravenmoor's corridors without a single misstep, one hand occasionally trailing the wall not for guidance but, she suspected, simply for the comfort of contact. He counted. She caught him at it once, his lips moving faintly as he crossed an open hall, and understood with a small jolt that he was counting his own footsteps, the way another man might count breaths to calm himself before sleep. "You're staring," he said, without turning toward her, the third time she watched him cross a room. "I wasn't aware staring required eyes to be noticed." The corner of his mouth lifted, brief and unguarded. "It doesn't. You breathe differently when you're staring. Quicker. Like you're holding something back." Arya felt heat climb her throat, and was grateful, for once, that he could not see exactly how far it rose. He was, she was slowly discovering, a man assembled almost entirely out of small mercies he never announced. The fire in her chamber was rebuilt before she ever thought to ask for it. A servant arrived one morning to inform her, with a small bow, that the library, long closed by all accounts, since before Cassandra's time managing the household, had been reopened that very week, at the king's order, for the new Luna's use. Arya had mentioned missing books exactly once, to no one but the empty air of her own room. He heard that, she realized, standing in the doorway of shelves dusted clean for her arrival. Of course he heard that. He hears everything. It should have comforted her. Instead, it frightened her in a way she didn't have a tidy name for. The particular fear of being deeply, thoroughly known by someone she had not yet decided whether to trust. Cassandra, for her part, seemed to appear wherever Arya's unease was thinnest, offering some small comment that thickened it again. "He doesn't sleep well," she mentioned once, watching Arya across the breakfast table with that same practiced warmth. "Hasn't in months. I worry the responsibilities of the kingdom weigh more on him than he lets anyone see. A blind alpha carries twice the burden of a sighted one, don't you think? Twice the doubt to overcome." "He seems to manage it well enough," Arya said. For now. Cassandra's smile didn't falter. "Things change quickly in a kingdom like this one. I only hope, for his sake, that they change for the better." It was a small sentence. It should have meant nothing. And yet Arya found it lodged in her thoughts for the rest of the day, returning at odd moments like a splinter she couldn't quite work free. That night she followed him. She told herself it was concern. She told herself it was simply the unbearable itch of unanswered questions. She did not let herself examine, too closely, the third and truer reason. That some old, foolish part of her had decided, somewhere in the last 4 days, that she wanted to know this man, wholly and without lies between them, and that wanting had nothing at all to do with concern. She kept to the shadows along the courtyard wall, barefoot despite the cold, watching Daemon's broad shape move with absolute certainty through darkness that should have swallowed any other man whole. He crossed the open ground, passed through the rear gate, and disappeared down a narrow path she had not yet had reason to walk. She followed at a careful distance, her heart loud enough in her own ears that she was certain, for one mad moment, that he would hear it too. The path bent through a thin stretch of trees and opened onto a modest stone house she had not known existed, set apart from the castle proper, its windows glowing gold with firelight. A figure was already waiting in the doorway before Daemon had even reached it. A man, older, leaning heavily on a cane, his face breaking into open relief at the sight of the king approaching. "You came," the old man said, his voice carrying faintly across the cold air. "I wasn't certain you would, not with everything happening up at the castle this week." "I told you I would," Daemon answered, and there was a warmth in his voice Arya had not yet heard him use with anyone, herself included. "Has it gotten worse since I last came?" "Some days, not others." The old man's hand found Daemon's shoulder, steadying himself, or perhaps simply needing to. "Come in, sit. Let an old soldier finish telling you the rest of what he started last time." The door closed behind them, and Arya stood alone in the dark, every careful theory she had built over 4 sleepless nights, collapsing quietly into something far less dramatic and far more difficult to dismiss. This was not a secret lover's house. But it was, unmistakably, still a secret, and the old man's words echoed back at her now with a weight she hadn't given them in the moment. Everything happening up at the castle this week. Something was happening at Ravenmoor, something no one had thought to tell its newest, most unwanted Luna. Chapter 5. Arya did not return to her chamber that night. She sat instead at the edge of the frozen garden, wrapped in her cloak, watching the lit window of the stone house, until the cold became something she could no longer ignore, and even then she carried the old man's words back with her, like an ember held too tightly in a closed fist. Everything happening up at the castle this week, she had assumed, walking into Ravenmoor, that whatever danger waited for her here would announce itself plainly. A raised voice, a locked door, a warning spoken aloud by someone who meant her harm. She was only beginning to understand that the truer dangers in a place like this rarely announced themselves at all. They moved quietly through breakfast conversations and offered comfort with one hand while taking something unnamed away with the other. She found Owen Walker the next morning before she found Daemon, a smaller mercy than she expected, given how rarely the king's beta left his side. He was alone in the armory, methodically checking the edge of a blade against his thumb with the distracted patience of a man whose hands needed something to do while his mind worked elsewhere. "You followed him last night," Owen said, without looking up. It wasn't a question, and Arya didn't bother pretending otherwise. "There's a sick man in a house behind the castle. Daemon visits him, cares for him, from the sound of it." She kept her voice even. "I want to know why no one thought that worth mentioning to me." Owen set the blade down. For a long moment he studied her the way a man studies a door he isn't certain he's been given permission to open. "That man served Damon's father," he said finally. "Lost the use of his legs defending this castle before either of us were old enough to understand what defending it meant. Damon visits him because no one else does, and because he hates the idea of anyone in this kingdom being forgotten the way he once feared he would be." Owen's jaw tightened. "It has nothing to do with you, my lady, and everything happening at this castle this week has even less to do with that old man's health." "Then what does it have to do with?" Owen was quiet long enough that Arya understood, with a sinking certainty, that he had already decided how much he was permitted to say, and that the answer was not enough. "Ask the king," he said instead. "It isn't mine to give you." She did not ask the king. Not that day, and not the day after, though she watched him more closely than she had allowed herself to before. Watched the way his hand occasionally pressed, briefly and almost absently, against his own temple, as though some pressure lived there that he had simply decided to grow used to. Watched the faint unsteadiness in his step on the third morning, gone again by midday, easy enough to miss unless you were already looking for exactly that kind of small, denied weakness. A man does not hide his pain because he is ashamed of feeling it. He hides it because he has learned, somewhere along the way, that other people's fear of his weakness is heavier to carry than the weakness itself. It was Cassandra, in the end, who handed her the next piece, carelessly, the way a person drops something they don't realize is sharp. "You've noticed, I'm sure," Cassandra said one afternoon, watching Arya over the rim of a teacup with eyes that missed nothing, how tired he seemed. "It happens, this time of year. The cold doesn't agree with old wounds." A pause, perfectly timed. "Though I suppose you wouldn't know about old wounds yet. You've only just arrived." "What wound?" Cassandra's smile thinned, just slightly, as though she'd allowed herself one careless step too far, and was now recalculating. "Nothing you need trouble yourself with, truly. I only meant that this kingdom has survived a great deal to still be standing. I'd hate for anyone to forget how much it costs to keep it that way." She set down her cup. "Especially anyone who only just married into the cost of it." There it was again, that same current beneath pleasant words. The implication that Arya's place here was provisional, borrowed, liable to be reconsidered if the wrong truth surfaced at the wrong time. That night, unable to settle, Arya did something she had not yet allowed herself to do since arriving at Ravenmoor. She sought Damon out directly, found him alone on the high balcony off the western tower, his face turned toward a wind he could feel but never see stirring the bare branches below. "Something is wrong here," she said, without preamble. "Not with the kingdom, with you. I've seen it in the way you favor your right hand some mornings and not others. I've heard it in the way Owen won't finish a sentence when your name comes up. And I've heard your cousin say just enough, twice now, to make certain I understand my place here is not entirely secure." She stepped closer, close enough that he turned fully toward her voice. "I lied to you once, about who I was. I won't pretend I don't understand what it costs to keep an important truth hidden, but I would like, very much, to stop being the only person in this castle who doesn't know what that truth is." Damon was silent long enough that the wind filled the space between them entirely. "If I tell you," he said at last, his voice low, rough, carrying a weight she hadn't heard in it before, "you will not be able to set it down again. Some truths are like that. Once you're holding them, they hold you back. I have spent my whole life holding things other people were too afraid to carry," Arya said. "I would rather hold something true than keep being protected by something false." Damon reached out, slowly, the way he did everything, as though each motion had to be measured first against the absence of sight, and found her hand without searching for it, his fingers closing around hers with quiet certainty. "There is a curse on me," he said. "It has been on me since I was a boy. It took my sight, and for a long time, that was the whole of what it cost." His thumb moved once, briefly, across her knuckles. "It no longer wants to settle for that." Chapter 6. The wind on the high balcony seemed to go very still, though Arya understood, distantly, that it was only her own breathing that had stopped. "What does that mean?" she asked carefully. "That it no longer wants to settle for that?" Damon's hand tightened around hers, not painfully, but with the particular pressure of a man steadying himself against something rather than someone. "It means the curse that blinded me as a boy was never meant to end there. I learned that only recently. Too recently to have done anything useful with the knowledge yet. He drew a slow breath. It was cast to weaken me long enough for someone to take what I hold, and then to finish what it started once that was done. Finish it how? By the next full moon. His voice did not shake, though something in it had gone very careful, the way a man speaks when he has decided not to let fear choose his words for him. If it isn't broken before then, it stops being a curse that only takes sight. Arya's chest went cold. And if it isn't broken, then I won't see another moon after that one. She had imagined many things might be waiting behind Damon Blackwood's careful silences. She had not imagined this. The wind found its voice again, moving through the bare branches below the balcony, and Arya stood very still in the middle of it, trying to understand how a man could speak his own death sentence in a voice that calm. "How is it broken?" she asked. "Curses are not stones, Damon. They don't simply wear away on their own. Something has to undo them." "A bond." He said it plainly, without the softness she half expected him to wrap around it. "The kind that forms between an alpha and the one fate has marked for him. It is the only thing strong enough to unmake what was done to me." "Then why?" Arya said slowly, the shape of the question forming, even as the answer to it frightened her. "Have you not already broken it? You are not a young man newly come into his power, Damon. You have had years to find someone. Because the curse has not always demanded this price." His jaw tightened. "For most of my life, it asked only for my sight, and I learned to live inside that cost the way a man learns to live inside any old wound. I did not go looking for a bond I did not yet need, with someone I had not yet found, simply because a kingdom expected its king to marry. I would not do that to anyone, least of all to whoever fate actually intended for me." A pause, weighted with something she couldn't yet name. "The price changed 3 months ago. Someone made certain of that. Someone close to you." It wasn't a question, not really, and Damon did not answer it as one. His silence was answer enough, heavy and unwilling, the silence of a man who already suspected a truth he had not yet allowed himself to fully believe. "Cassandra," Arya said quietly. "I have no proof." His voice was rough now, torn between loyalty and the cold arithmetic of who stood closest to him when the curse had sharpened its teeth. "She has run this kingdom's household since I was too young to do it myself. She has never once asked for the throne in all that time, not even when she could have. I do not want it to be her, but wanting is not the same as evidence, and I have learned the difference at considerable cost." Arya thought of the gallery, the teacup, the carefully dropped sentences designed to remind her, again and again, how provisional her place at Ravenmoor truly was. She thought of a woman with a smile too well practiced to be entirely sincere, speaking of fragility and burden, and how things change quickly in a kingdom like this one. "She has been preparing me," Arya said slowly, "for something. I didn't understand what, until now." "For my death," Damon said simply, "and for whatever comes after it, with a blind alpha removed, and no clear heir to take his place, but the woman who has already been running everything in his name for years." The full weight of it settled over Arya at last. Not merely a love story interrupted by misunderstanding, but a kingdom balanced on a deadline neither of them had chosen, with a woman inside its own walls counting down the same moon Damon was. "How long?" Arya asked. "Until the full moon?" 11 days. 11 days to prove what neither of them could yet prove. 11 days to undo what someone had spent months carefully arranging. 11 days for whatever was meant to grow between two strangers, bound by a stolen wedding, to become the one thing strong enough to outrun a death already in motion. "When we don't have time to be careful with each other," Arya said, surprising herself with how steady the words came out. "Whatever this is between us, whatever it is you knew the moment I said my vows, we don't have 11 days to pretend we're still strangers." Damon turned his face fully toward her voice, his pale eyes finding hers with that same unsettling, unlearnable precision, as though some sense she didn't have a name for could see straight through to exactly where she stood. "I knew you," he said quietly, "before you ever said a single word to me." Arya went still. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the moment you walked close enough at the altar, before your vows, before anything, I already knew you weren't who I had asked for." His thumb moved once more over her knuckles, and his voice dropped lower, rougher, carrying something that sounded almost like confession. Wolves know their mate by scent before they know anything else about them. I knew, the instant you stood close enough, that you were not a stranger fate had nothing to do with. The cold night air seemed to disappear entirely. Then you knew, Arya said slowly, piecing it together, even as it unraveled something inside her chest. From the very beginning, not just at the vows. Before that, you let me believe I had fooled you. I let you believe what you needed to believe, until I understood why you'd done it. His grip on her hand did not loosen. I am asking you now, Arya, to understand why I didn't say it sooner. And I am asking for far less time than either of us deserves to decide whether you can forgive that. Chapter 7. There is a particular kind of fury that only exists for the people we have already, secretly, decided to love. It burns hotter than ordinary anger precisely because it has nowhere honest to go. Arya pulled her hand free of his, not in cruelty, but because she needed the space to feel everything moving through her, without his pulse against her skin confusing it further. You let me walk into your home believing I had outsmarted a blind stranger, she said. You let me apologize. You let me carry the weight of a lie I thought only I was telling. Yes. Don't agree with me so easily. It isn't helping. The corner of his mouth moved, faint and unwilling, gone almost before it arrived. I am not trying to make it easier. I am trying to stop lying to you the only way I know how, by telling you exactly what I did, without softening it. Arya turned from him, walking the length of the balcony and back again, the way she had once paced a different room in front of a different silent man, though nothing about this felt the same as that night. Why, she said finally, facing him again. Of everything you could have told me, why let me believe the lie had worked? Because I did not yet know why you'd done it. His jaw was tight, his voice low. I know what desperate marriages look like, Arya. I have watched enough of them arranged around this kingdom to recognize the shape of one from a single church. I did not know, that first night, whether you had taken your sister's place to save her, or whether you had simply seen an opportunity to escape whatever your own life had become, at her expense. He exhaled slowly. I did not want to know you through accusation. I wanted to know you through what you chose to do, once you believed no one was watching closely enough to notice. And what did I do? You stayed close to a man everyone told you was a monster, when leaving would have cost you nothing. His voice roughened. You followed me last night out of worry, not suspicion. You asked Owen a question that put your own safety beneath your need to understand mine. You have spent 4 days quietly proving exactly who you are, without ever once asking me to notice you doing it. He paused. I did not need you to confess anything to me, Arya. I needed to see whether the woman who took her sister's place at an altar would still be the same woman once she believed there was nothing left to gain from kindness. Arya stood very still, the wind moving cold around them both, and found she had no immediate answer to give him, only the slow, uncomfortable recognition of being known more completely than she had let herself be known by anyone in 3 long years. That isn't fair, she said finally, though without much force behind it, testing someone without telling them they're being tested. No, he agreed, it isn't. I have spent a great deal of my life learning things about people I never asked them to teach me, simply because I could not see what they showed everyone else, and had to learn instead what they couldn't think to hide from a man who wasn't watching their face. Something raw moved through his voice. I am asking you to forgive a habit built from necessity, not cruelty. I will understand if you need more than 11 days to decide whether you can. It would have been easier, Arya thought, to stay angry at him. Anger asked nothing complicated of her. It was the gentler, more dangerous truth, that she understood exactly why a man who had been deceived his whole life by people assuming his blindness made him easy to manage, might choose, just once, to let a deception run its course until he understood its true shape. That left her without any solid ground to stand on. 11 days, she said instead, because it was the only piece of this conversation simple enough to hold on to. 11 days to break a curse that took years to build, cast by a woman I have to prove guilty before this kingdom will believe me over her. Yes. And if I am the one fate intended for you, she made herself say it plainly, refusing to hide behind the safety of implication, the way Cassandra so often did, then the bond breaks it. That's what you said. That's what I believe. Damon's voice dropped lower. I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I was, the moment you said your vows in a voice that wasn't the one I'd been promised. But certainty is not the same as proof, and I will not ask you to give yourself to me, in any sense, simply because a clock is running out for both of us. You deserve to choose this freely, not because 11 days makes the choice for you. It would have been the easier story, the kind told in taverns, the kind that made grand declarations sound effortless. Instead, here was a man offering her, even now, even with his own death quietly counting down somewhere behind his pale, unseeing eyes, the dignity of an honest choice rather than a desperate one. Then let me choose with my eyes open, Arya said, stepping close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him in the cold night air. Tell me everything. The curse, your cousin, the proof we'll need before this kingdom will believe a stranger over a woman they've trusted for years. All of it. I would rather walk into the next 11 days knowing exactly what we're fighting than spend them comfortable and unprepared. Daemon reached for her hand again, and this time she let him take it without hesitation. Then we begin tonight, he said. There is a healer 2 valleys from here, who first cursed me as a boy, on Cassandra's order, though she was young herself then, and I do not yet know what she promised in exchange. If that healer still lives, she is the only proof that exists outside our own word against my cousins. His grip tightened, certain, deliberate. I was going to go alone. I am no longer certain that's wise, for either of us. Then we go together, Arya said, and meant it more completely than she had meant almost anything, in 3 long years of learning exactly how much weight one person could be asked to carry alone. Chapter 8. They left before dawn, while the castle still slept, and Cassandra's chambers remained dark and undisturbed. A small mercy Arya hoped would last long enough to matter. Owen rode with them, silent and watchful, his hand never far from the blade at his hip, and 3 wolves from Daemon's pack ranged ahead and behind through the tree line, shapes glimpsed only as shadows moving faster than any horse could follow. You're certain she doesn't know we're going, Arya said, watching the castle disappear behind the first ridge. I'm certain of very little anymore. Daemon sat tall in the saddle beside her, his hand resting lightly on the reins more out of habit than necessity, the horse trained long ago to carry him by command of voice and shift of weight rather than sight. But Cassandra believes I trust her enough not to look for answers she hasn't already given me. That belief is the only advantage we have left. The journey took the better part of 2 days, through valleys Arya had never seen, and forests that grew steadily wilder the farther they traveled from Ravenmoor's borders. She watched Daemon navigate it all with the same unhurried certainty he carried through his own castle, counting paces between landmarks Owen quietly named for him, reading the change in wind and birdsong the way another man might read a map. It is a particular kind of courage, she thought, watching him, to move through a world that offers you no second chances to see what's coming, and to move through it anyway without ever once asking it to slow down for you. They found the healer's cottage on the evening of the 2nd day, smoke rising thin and gray from a chimney built into the side of a hill, half swallowed by forest that had clearly been left to grow wild and undisturbed for a very long time. The woman who answered the door was older than Arya expected, stooped and gray, her eyes clouded with the particular blue-white film of someone who had likely gone fully blind herself many years past. She went very still at the sound of Daemon's voice. I wondered, the old woman said quietly, whether you would come yourself, or send someone else to finish what I started. I came to ask you to undo it, Daemon said, not to punish you for casting it. The healer was silent for a long moment, her clouded eyes turned toward a face she could no longer see, though something in her expression suggested she remembered it perfectly well regardless. I cannot undo it, she said finally. No one can, not even me. A curse like that one settles into the bones of whoever carries it. It does not lift, it only ends, by breaking or by finishing what it was made to do. Then tell me who asked you to cast it. Daemon's voice was steady, though Arya heard the effort it cost him to keep it that way. I need it spoken aloud, by someone other than my own suspicion. The old woman's hands twisted together in her lap. I was young, she said, younger than you are now, and frightened of a girl who had already shown me what she was capable of arranging, when she didn't get what she wanted. She came to me with her father's coin and her own fury, and told me her cousin's birth had cost her a future she believed should have been hers by right. She did not ask me to kill you. I want you to understand that. She asked only for you to be made smaller, weaker, easier to overlook when the kingdom looked for its next alpha. Cassandra, Arya said softly, though she had already known. I never learned her face afterward, only her voice, and her coin, and the particular coldness of a girl young enough that I told myself, for years, that she could not possibly have meant the harm she clearly intended. The healer's voice cracked. I have carried that lie to myself longer than I should have. When word reached me 3 months ago that the curse had been paid for a second time, strengthened, given an ending it did not originally have, I understood I would not be able to carry it much longer. Will you speak this to my kingdom's council? Daemon asked. Not for my sake alone, for whatever debt you believe you owe for casting it in the first place. The old woman was quiet for a long time, the fire shifting and settling in the hearth behind her. I will speak it, she said finally. I am old, and blind myself now, and I find I no longer have much patience left for carrying secrets that were never truly mine to keep in the first place. It was not, Arya understood, the kind of proof that solved everything cleanly. An old woman's confession could be dismissed as confusion, or bitterness, or a stranger's word against a cousin's decades of loyal service. But it was a beginning, a single loose thread in a lie that had been woven carefully enough to survive years of careful silence. And sometimes a single thread, pulled hard enough, is all it takes to unmake something that looked, from the outside, entirely whole. They rode back toward Ravenmoor the following morning, with 6 days left before the full moon, the healer traveling slowly behind them in a covered cart, and Arya found herself watching Daemon's profile against the pale morning light, thinking of every small mercy he had built into her first days at Ravenmoor, without once asking to be thanked for any of them. 6 days, she said quietly, to break a curse, expose your cousin, and convince a kingdom to believe an old blind woman over the woman who has run their household for years. 6 days, Daemon agreed. Then, after a moment, his hand finding hers again on the narrow space between their horses, I would rather have 6 honest days with you than 60 dishonest years without you, Arya. I need you to know that, whatever happens at the end of this. It was, Arya thought, the kind of sentence she would carry with her regardless of how the next 6 days unfolded. Proof that some men learn to speak most clearly the things that matter most, only once they have nothing left to lose by saying them. Chapter 9. They returned to Ravenmoor under cover of a gray, low-hanging dusk, and Owen took the healer quietly to rooms in the castle's oldest wing. Rooms Cassandra rarely visited, rooms with walls thick enough to keep a secret a few days longer if it needed keeping. Cassandra herself greeted them in the main hall with nothing but warmth, as though 3 days of unexplained absence required no explanation at all between family. You've been gone, she said, embracing Daemon lightly, her eyes finding Arya's over his shoulder with something sharp behind the welcome. I worried. We rode to clear my head, Daemon said. Married life requires some adjustment. I imagine it does. Cassandra's smile did not waver, though Arya caught, for just a moment, the particular stillness of someone recalculating quickly behind a pleasant face. You look well, Lady Bennet. Marriage agrees with you. It's beginning to, Arya said, and meant it more than she expected to. That night, alone in Daemon's chambers for the first time since the wedding, Arya understood that whatever came next could not be rushed simply because a moon was counting down somewhere above them. A bond born of fear was no bond at all, only 2 frightened people mistaking urgency for certainty. I need you to understand something, she said, standing close enough to feel the warmth of the fire and the warmth of him both. I am not doing this because 11 days became 5. I want you to hear that clearly, because I think some part of you needs to. Daemon's hand found her face, gentle, deliberate, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek the way a man memorizes something he intends to carry with him, regardless of what tomorrow brings. Then tell me why you are doing this. Because you built a library for a woman who mentioned, once, in an empty room, that she missed reading. Arya's voice caught, steadied. Because you visit an old soldier no one else remembers, and count your own footsteps, so you never have to ask anyone for help you haven't decided yet to need. Because you let me believe I had fooled you, and then spent 4 days proving, without ever asking me to notice, that you were the safest thing that had happened to me in 3 years. She pressed her hand over his. I am not choosing you because a curse demands it, Daemon. I am choosing you because I already had. before I understood there was a clock involved at all. Something moved through his face then that she had not yet seen from him. Not the careful half-smile, not the measured stillness, but something raw and unguarded. The expression of a man who had spent his whole life being looked at as a burden or a danger, finally being looked at as something else entirely. I fell in love with the sound of your voice the moment you said vows that weren't meant for me, he said quietly. I have spent every day since trying to deserve having heard it. When he kissed her, it was without hesitation, without the careful restraint he had measured into every other touch since she'd arrived. And Arya understood, in that single unguarded moment, that some truths are not spoken at all, but simply given, completely, between two people who have finally stopped protecting themselves from each other. Later, when he asked the silent question with his eyes closed and his forehead pressed against hers, she answered it the only way that felt honest. Yes, she said. I want to hear you the way your pack does. I want there to be no more silence left between us that isn't chosen on purpose. Daemon lowered his mouth to the curve of her neck, his breath unsteady against her skin, and when he finally bit down, it was with a gentleness so complete, it felt less like claiming and more like being welcomed somewhere she had not known, until that exact moment, that she had been searching for her entire life. The warmth that followed had no name in any language Arya knew. It moved through her chest and down through her hands, and somewhere beneath it, faint and growing steadier with every passing second, she felt something that was unmistakably him. Relief and love, and a fear finally beginning to loosen its grip after years of being carried alone. Can you hear me? His voice said, inside her mind, rough and clear and entirely his own. I can hear you, she answered, and felt his smile before she ever opened her eyes to look for it. In the morning, the castle's physician confirmed what Arya had already begun to suspect on the ride home from the valley 2 days prior. A new life beginning, small and entirely unplanned, woven now into everything that still needed to be fought for in the 5 days remaining before the moon demanded its answer. Daemon went very still when she told him, his hand finding her stomach with the same careful reverence he gave everything he could not see but had learned, long ago, to trust completely. A family, he said, his voice breaking slightly around the word. Arya, you have given me a family I did not let myself believe I was still allowed to want. It should have been the ending. In a kinder story, perhaps it would have been. But 5 days still stood between them and the full moon. And somewhere in the castle's oldest wing, an old healer waited to speak a truth that a woman with a practiced smile had spent months making certain no one would ever ask her to say aloud. Chapter 10. Word travels through a castle the way smoke moves through a closed room, quietly, finding every gap, reaching corners no one thought to seal. By the 4th day, Cassandra knew an old woman had been brought back from the valley. She came to Arya first, alone, in the same gallery where she had once offered her first careful warning. You've made a mistake, Cassandra said, her voice low, the warmth finally entirely gone from it. Whatever that woman told you in the valley, she is old and half-mad, and was paid generously enough, years ago, by men who wanted Daemon weakened for reasons that had nothing to do with me. I would think carefully, Lady Bennet, before you stand in front of this kingdom's council and stake your husband's throne on the word of someone like that. I think you're frightened, Arya said, and watched something flicker behind Cassandra's composed face. Not of being wrong, of being known. Cassandra's jaw tightened, the mask slipping just enough for Arya to glimpse, finally, the fury that had been sitting patiently beneath it for years. I raised that boy when his own mother's ashes were still warm in the rubble of this castle. I taught him to navigate halls he would never see again. I ran this kingdom while everyone waited to see whether a blind alpha would survive his own coronation, and when he did, I stepped aside without complaint and let him take what I had kept whole for him. Her voice shook, just once, and the moment it became clear the council was beginning to ask whether a king who cannot see his own enemies coming is fit to keep leading them, the moment that question started being whispered in rooms I was no longer welcome in, I understood that no one was going to protect what I had built unless I protected it myself. By killing him. By ensuring, Cassandra said, each word controlled now, deliberate, that if he fell, it would be to something the council could understand. not blindness. Something with an ending, something that let everyone grieve cleanly and move forward with someone who had already proven she knew how to hold this kingdom together. Her eyes were bright, unblinking. I never wanted him dead, Arya. I wanted him gone slowly enough that no one would ever think to ask who benefited from it. It was, Arya thought, the particular tragedy of a person who had convinced themselves, over years of careful justification, that cruelty done slowly enough stops counting as cruelty at all. He'll have to hear this from you directly, Arya said quietly. Not from me, not from the healer, from you. And if I refuse, then the council hears it from an old woman whose only motive for lying would be inventing a complete fiction about a curse that has, in fact, blinded a child, and is now, in fact, threatening to kill a king, which is rather a lot of coincidence to dismiss as madness. Arya held her ground, steady despite the cold fury radiating from the woman in front of her. You have one choice left that still belongs to you, Cassandra. Everything after this belongs to the council. The council fire burned that evening in the great hall. Elders and pack leaders gathered in a circle that had not been called in Arya's brief time at Ravenmoor, and she stood beside Daemon as the healer's testimony was given slowly, plainly, without embellishment. A girl's coin and fury, a curse meant to weaken rather than kill, a second payment 3 months past that had given the curse an ending it was never meant to have. Cassandra did not deny it when her turn came. She stood very straight, her composure intact even now, and confirmed every word the healer had spoken in a voice that did not shake once, as though confession itself were simply one more burden she had decided, finally, to carry without flinching. I will not ask for mercy I haven't earned, she said when she finished. I will only say that everything I did, I believed I was doing for this kingdom's sake, even when I understood it was also for my own. The council's judgment was not Arya's to give, and she did not envy the elders the weight of deciding it. Exile in the end, rather than execution. A sentence Daemon himself argued for, quietly, against more than one voice in that circle who wanted harsher justice for a cousin who had nearly let him die. She is still the only family I had left from before the fire, Daemon said simply, when Owen asked him why. I will not let what she did erase what she also was. For a very long time, before fear convinced her to become something smaller. It was, Arya thought, listening to him, one more proof of something she was only beginning to fully understand about the man she had married. That mercy, freely given to someone who had earned the opposite, costs the giver far more than cruelty ever would, and that Daemon Blackwood had decided, somewhere in his long years of learning, to forgive a world that rarely deserved it, that the cost was worth paying anyway. 3 days remained before the full moon. The curse, the healer confirmed once more before her own quiet departure from Ravenmoor, had already begun to weaken from the moment the bond was completed. A slow unraveling rather than an instant one, the way ice breaks apart gradually once the first true crack finds it. It will finish what it's doing on the night of the full moon, the healer said. Whether that ending kills him or finally sets him free depends entirely on whether the bond holds true once the moon calls it to answer. Daemon did not seem afraid, listening to this. He simply reached for Arya's hand, the way he had reached for it a dozen times now without ever once needing to search for where it was, and held it as though 3 days were nothing at all to wait, now that he finally knew exactly what waited on the other side of them. Chapter 11. The night arrived the way important nights often do, quietly at first, the sky clearing to a deep and patient blue, the air gone still in the particular way that comes before something irreversible. Arya stood with Daemon on the same high balcony where he had first told her the truth. 11 days that felt now like an entire lifetime ago. Below them, Ravenmoor's courtyard had filled with most of the pack, drawn there by an instinct none of them fully understood yet. The old, wordless certainty that something was happening tonight that the whole kingdom would carry forward, one way or another. Tell me what you feel, Arya said, her hand resting over his heart, steady against the fabric of his shirt. Pressure, Daemon said, like a held breath that has been held too long to remember how to release naturally. His jaw tightened briefly. It isn't pain, exactly. It is closer to waiting, as though something in me has finally been given a date, after years of simply enduring without one. The moon rose slowly, full and pale, climbing clear of the tree line until its light spilled silver across the courtyard stones. Arya felt the change in Damon before she saw it, a tremor beneath her palm, his breath catching, his hand finding hers and gripping it with sudden, urgent strength. Arya. His voice in her mind was rougher than she had ever heard it, fraying at the edges. Something is pulling. I'm here, she said aloud, and silently, both at once, refusing to let either version of her voice waver. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this is, you don't carry it alone tonight. He dropped to one knee, his hand still locked around hers, and for one terrible moment, Arya believed she was watching the curse finish exactly what it had been built to do. Watching a man who had survived a fire, a childhood of careful smallness, and 11 days of fighting for a future he'd only just begun to believe he deserved, lose that future in the single moment the moon finally called its debt due. Then his shoulders shook, once, hard, and he made a sound that was not pain at all, but something closer to a man finally setting down a weight he had carried for so long he had forgotten what his own spine felt like without it. Light moved beneath his skin, not the moonlight, something else, something old and pale gold, gathering at his temples and behind his closed eyes the way dawn gathers behind a hill before it breaks fully over the horizon. Arya, his voice said again, and this time it was not fraying, it was something closer to wonder. What is it? She knelt with him, both hands now framing his face. Damon, talk to me. His eyes opened. For one long moment, neither of them moved. Arya watched his face the way a person watches weather change, slowly, then all at once, watched his pale, unfocused eyes sharpen, narrow, find something to fix themselves to for the first time in longer than he had been able to count. Arya, he said aloud now, his voice breaking completely on her name. I can see you. The courtyard below had gone utterly silent, the pack watching their king with an attention that bordered on reverence, but Arya barely registered any of it. She was watching Damon's face take her in for the first time as an adult man, rather than a half-remembered, fragmented boy's memory of color and shape, watching his eyes move slowly over her features the way his hands had once mapped them in the dark, except now there was no dark left between them at all. You're real, he said, his thumb brushing her cheek, his voice thick with something too large for words alone to carry. I always believed it, but I never let myself imagine. He stopped, overcome, and simply looked at her instead, the way a man looks at something he has waited his entire life to see, and still cannot quite believe, is finally, truly, in front of him. A man does not weep easily who has spent his whole life learning to carry sorrow without showing it to anyone. Damon Blackwood wept then anyway, openly, without shame, and Arya held his face in both hands and let him. Below, the pack began to howl, not in alarm, but in something closer to celebration, the old wordless language of wolves who understood, even without being told plainly, that their king had crossed from one kind of life into another, beneath the same moon that had once tried to end him. The curse, Arya said softly, when he could finally speak again. It's broken. It's gone. Damon's hand found her stomach, resting there with the same reverent certainty he had once given to things he could only feel and never see. Everything it took from me, it's given back tenfold tonight. He looked up at her, his pale eyes no longer unfocused, no longer searching for sounds to navigate by, simply seeing her, fully, the way he had always known her by every sense, except the one finally returned to him. I knew your voice before I ever knew your face, Arya. I have spent 11 days falling in love with a woman I had never once seen. His voice dropped, rough with feeling. I did not know it was possible to fall in love with someone twice, once for who you were in the dark, and once more completely, for who you are in the light. The moon stood high and full and silver above Ravenmoor, and below it, for the first time since a fire had taken everything from a frightened boy years ago, the kingdom's king finally looked, with his own two eyes, at the family he had never let himself believe he was still allowed to want. Chapter 12. Spring came early to Ravenmoor that year, or perhaps it had simply always arrived this gently, and no one had been paying close enough attention before to notice. The small white flowers Arya had once mentioned missing, in an empty room she'd believed held no one listening, grew now in wide, deliberate beds beneath nearly every window in the castle, planted, she would later learn, by Damon's own hand in the weeks after his sight returned, as though he needed to see for himself the thing he had once only been told was there. Cassandra's exile took her south, beyond the kingdom's borders, to a quiet holding, where she lived alone with whatever peace she could make with herself. Damon wrote to her twice that first year. Not forgiveness exactly, Arya understood, but the deliberate, ongoing choice not to let bitterness finish what fear had started. Whether Cassandra ever answered those letters, Arya never asked, and Damon never said. Some doors are better left to close in their own time, without anyone standing in the frame insisting on watching them shut. Lily came to Ravenmoor that summer, finally certain enough of her own safety to make the journey, and the sisters wept in the same gallery where Cassandra had once measured Arya's worth in careful, poisoned compliments. Lily stayed 3 months, then 6, then simply stopped speaking of leaving at all, having found in Owen Walker's quiet steadiness something she had never quite let herself hope for back in Marrow Hollow. Their parents arrived not long after, their father's old limp eased somewhat by a physician Damon insisted on, their mother rediscovering, in Ravenmoor's gardens, the particular joy of growing something simply because it was beautiful, rather than because it could be sold. A kingdom does not heal because one curse breaks. It heals slowly, the way a body heals, one small mercy at a time, repeated often enough that eventually the scar tissue holds as well as anything whole ever did. Damon governed differently after his sight returned, though not, Arya noticed, because he had stopped trusting the senses that had carried him faithfully for years. He simply added sight to everything he already knew how to do without it, still counting his steps through familiar halls out of habit rather than necessity, still listening for the particular catch in a person's breath that told him more than their face ever could, now simply able to watch that breath catch as well as hear it. "You could have asked me to stop doing that," Arya said once, watching him count silently under his breath as he crossed their bedchamber toward her. "Now that you don't need to anymore." "I don't need to," he agreed, reaching her, his hand finding her waist with the same certainty it always had. "I want to. Some habits are not burdens, Arya. Some of them are simply how a person learned to love the world carefully, and there's no good reason to abandon care just because it's no longer required." It was, she thought, one of the truest things he had ever said to her, that the things we build to survive difficulty do not need to be discarded the moment the difficulty ends. Sometimes they become, instead, the gentlest parts of who we've grown into. Their daughter was born in the dead of winter, beneath a moon that was, for once, not full at all, simply ordinary and quiet and entirely uneventful in the best possible way. Damon held her for the first time with the particular reverence of a man memorizing a face he intended never to forget, and when Arya asked him, gently, what color her eyes were, he laughed. A full, unguarded sound she had learned, over the past year, was rarer and more precious than almost anything else he gave her. "They're yours," he said, "exactly yours. I'd know them anywhere, even in the dark." Outside, the pack had already begun to gather in the courtyard, the way they had the night the curse broke. Drawn by some old instinct toward a celebration, none of them needed instructions to understand. And somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the howling and the candlelight and the quiet, ordinary joy of a kingdom finally permitted to simply be happy, Arya understood the particular truth she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had walked into that empty church believing she was sacrificing herself to save someone else. She had not understood, not then, that some sacrifices are simply love arriving early, in the only disguise it had available, waiting patiently to be recognized for what it always truly was. He had never once mistaken her voice. Not at the altar, not in the dark, not across 11 days that could have ended in grief instead of this. And she understood now, holding their daughter beside the man who had loved her before he ever saw her face, that some people are not found by accident at all. Some people are simply, finally, recognized.